Well, hey, good morning again. Good to see you. Okay, so two things on the front end before we kind of dive into closing out the book of Ruth this morning. The first thing is, and I mentioned it in the first, I mentioned it in the kind of the welcome. As we're moving into 3 services, there's a very real reality that there's people in this room that are way more talented at doing things here than people are that are currently potentially, no, that sounds terrible. Let me say it another way. That was a total failure. Chance is not great at sound. Is anyone better at sound? I'm just kidding. All right, so don't joke. The reality is, as we transition to 3 services, people need to jump on board and need to get involved and build community through service. And so there's a little card on your chair. If you're like, hey, I'm going to scan that thing and just kind of see what's out there, see what where I can get connected, where I can use my gift set. It could be production, worship, setup, kids, any kind of sermon, preaching, maybe. So any of those things, you can go in there, check the box, put your name in. We'll follow up with you if you want to get connected. Second thing I'm going to let you know about is, so when the Ukrainian refugee crisis kind of started up, we were kind of begin to put some teams together in place, begin to raise some money to be able to kind of meet needs as they arose and to kind of help on the ground. And so the organization that we're working with for that transition to helping refugees get into the States reached out to us about a week ago. This is really quick and moving really fast, but they reached out to us about a week ago and they said, hey, we have a family of 6 from Afghanistan. Could you guys take them on? And so we were like, yes, of course, we'll take them on. And so housing has been secured in Dorchester, all those types of things. But there are all kinds of other elements that need to happen to take care of them. And I will, as those kind of needs come about, as we kind of get an idea of what that's going to look like, I will be communicating and let you know kind of how that's what that's gonna look like. And so I'm gonna pick them up on Monday night at like 11 p.m. at night. And so they have a 2-year-old. So here's a couple of things. First of all, just pray, like as they kind of transition into Boston. Most likely they don't know. Maybe the dad knows English, maybe he doesn't, we're not sure. They've got to get enrolled in school. They have to get enrolled in Mass Health. They have to get enrolled in all kinds of things. Like it is the process by which getting them into the city and getting them placed is a pretty significant process. And so I say that in part to say, if you're here and you're like, I'm a Boston public school beast, right? If you need help getting them registered, you're like, I'm your person. I'm your individual. If you would just see me afterwards, you can let me know. Or if you're like, I'm a Mass Health, like I got the back door on that thing. If that's you and you're like, I'm just incredibly talented at that, I can promise you're better at that than I am. And so if that's where you're at, any of those things, or if you're like, hey, how can I help? You can fill out a card in the back. Afterwards, we can get in more contact with you. So we do have a team from our church and from a few other churches in the area that are kind of beginning to kind of come around and figure out, okay, how do we take care of them and how do we love them? So if you could pray for them, they're going to be here Monday night, and just pray for them as they kind of transition into the States. There are a significant amount of you that are here that understand that kind of transition into a new place. You understand that transition and the difficulty of that, and how overwhelming that can feel. And so if you could just kind of pray for them and pray God's presence and peace over them, that would be really helpful in that. But I'll let you know more kind of practical ways as we begin in that process. And so I do want to say thanks. Like it was because of the generosity of our church, because we have a church that gives and cares, we've got the funding to help them like that we have these things in place to be able to say, yes, we can do that. And so I'll communicate that as we go. Everyone good with that? Cool. Okay. Ruth chapter 4. Okay. So we're finishing out a series that we entitled Everyday Faithfulness. So for the last 3 weeks, we've been walking through the book of Ruth, and now we're into Ruth chapter 4. And so really the question that we're going to be dealing with this morning is, what's the purpose of Ruth? Like, why do we have this book? Like, what is it that if we're kind of reading the book of Ruth, what should we walk away with that would be helpful for us? What is it that is trying to, the author, the narrator is trying to get across to us for our kind of Christian discipleship. Now, one of the things that's become really obvious as I've been reading the book and been thinking about kind of the last 2 years. I don't know if your last 2 years has been anything like my last 2 years. It's been super simple, very not complex. No, like the last 2 years, and for a lot of you, and for myself included, have been the most difficult, troubling 2 years of your entire life. Like that's just the reality of, if we kind of take the sum of everything that's been going on in kind of our cultural moment and just feeling the pressure of that, it has felt immense as we kind of think about living life, living as someone following the way of Jesus. And so I begin to think about that in terms of the book of Ruth. And here's what I think. Here's, I think, the answer to what does the book of Ruth teach us. And so let me read this for you. It's all of these words are used with intention. So I'll read them for us. The life of the godly. So those seeking to live a godly life, those seeking to live the way of Jesus. The life of the godly is a complex and difficult journey that does arrive in the presence and the promises of God. Let me say it again so that you have it, and then we'll work out of this definition. So the life of the godly is a complex and difficult journey that does find itself in the presence and the promises of God. Now, sometimes when we think about life with God, we have a tendency to think that life with God is like just a straight line, where it's like, okay, I've given my life to Jesus, I've said yes to the way of Jesus, and so therefore God cares for me, therefore life should look like this. And we kind of organize it as this kind of straight line, right? It's like as if you got on Newberry, open Newberry's today. Some of you found out when you tried to park. If you got on the end of Newberry and you went straight to Mass Ave here, you would what? It was just a straight line that just kind of goes straight. Like if you get lost on Newberry, you got a problem. It's just straight, right? Just stay straight. There's no twists and turns. And so sometimes we think about life, or Christian life, is that kind of way. Okay, life is just going to look like this. The reality is that the Christian life is more like a drive to the Adirondack Mountains, where it's like elevation is all over the place. There's turns, there's curves. Like it's kind of like it. The Christian life is a lot more like driving through a mountainous road than it is walking down just kind of a straight path. Like if you live life long enough with God, what you find out is that life with God is still full of complexity. It's still full of difficulty. It's still full of disappointment. It's still full of confusion. Like that is just our reality. I mean, the book of Ruth, we're kind of standing over the book of Ruth. So we're reading it. We can fast forward to the end, right? We can do that. We can go, okay, well, it's going to end up well for Ruth. Like we can do that. But the reality for Ruth and for Naomi is that if you're looking at their life, it was complex and difficult. It's all over the place. It began, we'll get into it, but it began with death. Not a mountaintop moment, a really very much a valley kind of moment. But if you get to the end of Ruth, and this is true of the Christian journey, the reality as a people living the way of Jesus, following, giving our life to Jesus, the reality is that at the end, we will arrive with the promises of God in the presence of God. That is truth. That's the end of the journey for us. I think that's what the book of Ruth, despite all the things that are kind of going on around it, is seeking to teach us. So let's look at a few things here. So let me do a little bit of a review in case you haven't been here, kind of catch us up, and then we'll dive into specifically into chapter 4. So in chapter 1, if you don't know the story, so in chapter 1, Elimelech, which is Naomi's husband, decides to leave the land that God has given them, and they move to Moab. Moab is the territory of the enemy, essentially. There's scripture to the Israelites condemning the people of Moab, right? So this is not a land that God is like, good job, right? Good job, Elimelech. Glad you did that. But what the scriptures tell us is that there was a famine in the land of God, the land that God had given them in Canaan. And so they left and went into Moab with the thought that there's nothing left for us here. So we'll go to Moab. And so the story teaches us in the very beginning that they move. Now it quickly falls from there. What we know is that Elimelech dies. Naomi's husband dies. The next thing that we know is that her two sons, Naomi's two sons, marry Moabite women, and that they're married to these Moabite women for 10 years. And then the text also kind of gives us insight into the fact that these women that they're married to were barren, that they didn't have children. So very quickly, Ruth chapter 1, this is what we have. They've sold their property in the land that God had given them. They've moved. The husband has died. The sons have died. And now you have Naomi, who's the mother-in-law in a sense. And you have Orpah and Ruth, right? I mean, that's a dynamic, right? Mother-in-law and two daughters-in-law are together. And this is essentially how Ruth 1 ends with really Naomi saying to them, hey, you have no future where I'm going, go back. Stay in Moab, I'm leaving, I'm going back, the famine's over, God's cared for his people, so I'm gonna go back, you guys stay here. So Orpah, the story tells us, right, Oprah, she goes and leaves, she goes back and she just knows, hey, my chances are better in Moab, so I'm gonna do that. And then Ruth is like, no, I'm cleaving to you. Like, I'm not leaving you. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. I'm cleaving tightly to you. That's where we get in Ruth chapter 1. In Ruth chapter 2, they're now in the land. And so Ruth chapter 1, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, this is like a ridiculous story of like desperation and brokenness. So then you get into chapter 2, and chapter 2 is not too bad. It tells us that Ruth begins to glean in the land of a man named Boaz. And the narrator even draws our attention to the fact that God is working, because he says just happens to be in the territory and the field of Boaz, which basically just means, hey, pay attention. Pay attention here. It's a rhetorical device to say, pay attention. Did she really happen to land in Boaz's property? And then Ruth chapter 2 tells us that Ruth meets Boaz. Boaz shows kindness to her, tells her to glean in the field, says, hey, you can get hurt in this land because you're a Moabite. Stay close to my workers. Don't glean on the edges like the poor, but actually glean with my workers. It's an incredible thing. But we know that in Ruth 2, Boaz, you kind of feel like some chemistry is happening, but there's no he doesn't make a move, essentially, right? It's like a rom-com, right? It's like the plot's developing. You get into Ruth chapter 3, which is what Cohen looked at last week, and you have basically Ruth 3 starts with Naomi and Ruth saying, okay, we got a plan. Sounds culturally weird to us, right? This plan, like, go into the night. And okay, so it's weird, all right? But essentially, let me just summarize for you. Ruth goes to Boaz and says, hey, will you marry me and redeem Naomi's family? Boaz, we learn, is what the scriptures call a kinsman redeemer, which means he has the rights and the ability to buy back Naomi's land from whoever owned it, whoever they sold it to, and reclaim kind of the legacy of Elimelech and Naomi's family. This is something that God had, essentially this is what was happening. God had put in place in his society, in his people, in the Israelites. He did not want to see this economic disparity to go on. So he didn't want to have the rich here and the poor here. So he put some things in place that essentially said, hey, we're going to, every 50 years, you have to give the land back no matter what, right? Hope you enjoyed it. Now it's not yours anymore, right? So he's like, it's going back to whoever originally we promised this land to, here it's back to you. He also put this thing in place called the Kinsman Redeemer that just said, hey, you can buy back the land. They have to sell it to you if you are in the line of that particular family that used to own it. So in God's kindness, he's doing these types of things. So they learn that Boaz can do this. And so Ruth goes into him and says, hey, will you marry me? Will you, it's like a Jennifer Lopez. What's that movie? Will you marry me? Okay. Sorry, you haven't seen that. It's a pretty good one. And the scriptures tell us that Boaz is like, okay, there's actually another kinsman redeemer that has a chance to marry you. And so we're kind of left in Ruth chapter 3, moving into chapter 4, wondering, okay, what's going to happen? how is this story going to play out? Okay, Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. We'll look at 1 through 4 and a couple of thoughts here. So it says, Boaz went to the gate of the town and sat down there. Soon the family redeemer, Boaz, had spoken about, came by. So this other individual that we don't know much about has now come by, and Boaz said, come over here and sit down. So he went and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men from the town's elders and said, sit here, and they sat down. He said to the redeemer, Naomi, who's returned from the territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should inform you, buy it back in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of the people. If you want to redeem it, do it. But if you do not want to redeem it, tell me so that I will know, because there isn't anyone other than you to redeem it, and I am next after you. Right now, if you're following the story, you're like, come on, Boaz, you got it, bro. Like you're like cheering. This is the part of the story where you're like, come on, please, right? It's like in a romantic comedy, the ex-boyfriend shows up and there's like some chemistry going. You're like, oh no, it's not this guy again, right? You know better, right? This is kind of the part, right? Where we're like, okay, Boaz has so much integrity and so desires to honor God that despite the fact that despite the way that he feels towards Ruth, he says, there's actually another guy in line. And so Ruth chapter 4 begins by telling us that he's saying, okay, here's this other one. We need to go talk to him. Now, he basically lays out the situation. Boaz lays out the situation to this gentleman and says, will you do it? Now, to our dismay, in verse 4, this kinsman redeemer says what? I will do it. And we're like, oh, no. So then what the scriptures tell us, that Boaz essentially says to her, okay, that's great. Good to hear that you'll buy back the land. By the way, Naomi has a daughter-in-law named Ruth. And so if you're going to redeem the land, you have to marry her, and you'll have, ideally, you'll have children with her, raise up the offspring in the name of Mahlon, which was her husband. Now, the kinsman redeemer, his generosity only goes so far, right? We're like, that sounds like a little more than I was anticipating. And so he says, no, I'm not going to redeem it. He said, basically, you do it. You redeem the land. I can't marry her. For whatever reason, he says, I'm not going to do it myself. It'll ruin my own inheritance. We see that in verse 6. So he says, I give up my right to redeem. You can have the right. Okay, so here's what we pick up in verse 9. So this is what Boaz does. So Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech. Chilion and Mahlon, so the whole lineage, verse 10, he says, I've also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today. All right, so Boaz is like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to redeem the land. I'm going to take Ruth, as like he has already fallen in love with Ruth, and he's like, I'm going to take Ruth as my wife. Verse 11, it says, all the people who were at the city gate, including the elders, said, we are witnesses. And then some really interesting things are going to be said. It says, may the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah. Now, we'll talk about that in a second. Who together built the house of Israel, and may you be powerful in Ephraim, and your name be well known in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez that the son of Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman. A lot happening here that they're saying now. Okay, we see it. May the Lord, we'll talk about it in a second, but basically says, may the Lord bless this marriage. We're going to pray for this marriage. Okay, so we get down to verse 14, Ruth 4:14, and this is what it says, and we'll come around this in a second. It says, the woman said to Naomi. Now, this is really interesting because now Naomi becomes the focus of the story. Now, remember, I said the book of Ruth, like I think one of the main purposes of the book of Ruth is to show us the life of the godly is a complex and difficult journey that does arrive in the presence of God and in the promises of God. That's what I said. So the beginning of Ruth begins with who? Naomi. And it begins with what? Her story of death and loss. Her tragic story of moving from married with 2 sons to now widow with no supposed hope of a future. So now we get to the end of the book of Ruth. Verse 14, it says, the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who's not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel." Verse 15, "He will redeem your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons," we'll come back to that, "has given birth to him." Verse 16, Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became a mother to him. And the neighbor women said, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, here's what's interesting. If you notice in verse 17, it says the women said what? A son has been born to Naomi. Not a son has been born to Ruth, but a son has been born to Naomi. Now, why did they say that? Remember, this is ultimately Naomi's story. Like, this is ultimately about what God is going to do for Naomi through Ruth and Boaz. And so we get to the end, and the brunt of the story is on God's faithfulness and kindness to Naomi. It says, you began with death, but now there's life. Your story began with tragedy, and now there's joy. Do you see that? You now have a son. Who's to you, Naomi? God has been faithful to you despite the circumstances in which you found yourself in your entire life, or the life in which we have seen, in the life that we understand. We know in chapter 1, verse 21, Ruth's response to everything that is going on around her is, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." That she ends chapter 1 in bitterness and anger, rightfully so. That God's abandoned her. This is the way that she feels. I think that if we could just learn to wait and trust God, thinking about our story, I think that if we could just learn to wait and trust God, all of our complaints against him would prove themselves untrue. If we would learn to wait and trust, our complaints would become untrue. This is what we see of Ruth. Okay, or Naomi. So how do we know that God's taking care of Naomi? How do we know that God hasn't abandoned Naomi? How do we know that God hasn't abandoned us? For thinking about our journey and thinking about her journey, there's three things that we see here that essentially serves as like a signpost to say, hey, God's still for you, Naomi. Here's the 3 things. Some of it will be a bit of a review, some of it won't. The first one is the gift of Ruth. I mean, Ruth's story here is incredible. I mean, Naomi is in Moab. For all intents and purposes, her life's over. No future. And then this daughter-in-law, Ruth, is like, no, I'm committed to you. I am for you. I'm not leaving you. Like, Ruth knows that she would have, or supposes and assumes that she would have a better life in Moab. Like, she knows that. Like, that's why Orpah left, because she could go and marry and hopefully have children and be in her hometown. Like, Ruth knows what she's doing is dangerous. She knows what she's doing, for all intents and purposes, may not like work out for her best. But she also knows that Naomi will be desolate. She'll be alone. Now, that's service level stuff, right? So if you're reading the book of Ruth, you have to almost think of it as like a play, right? Like a literal play. And on the front of stage is Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi. And they're kind of working this thing out. They're practicing what we call hesed, which is this Hebrew term for covenant love. It means kindness, covenantal love. It's this deep type of commitment. And they're practicing that with one another, loving one another well. They're committing to one another. That's kind of like what's happening front of stage. And then what's really happening back of stage in the book of Ruth is what? God's backstage, alleviating famine, bringing new life, working the situation in such a way where God's going to be able to say to Naomi, no, I'm for you. I know it feels like I'm not, but I am. And Ruth is one of the signposts to Naomi to say, God's still present with you. Now, we know that because in Ruth 1, verse 16, it tells us that the really the root of Ruth's commitment to Naomi is really Ruth's commitment to Naomi's God, where she says, your God will be my God. I have fallen in love with your God. And so I'm going with you. I'm going to do this with you. We also see in Ruth chapter 2, verse 12, the reason that Ruth is displaying this type of amazing love to Naomi and feels confident to display this type of love to Naomi. It says, because the text tells us, verse 12, that she is one who's come under the refuge. She's come to take refuge under the wings of God. So Ruth's like, no, I have courage. I'm going to move forward because your God, I feel cared for and protected by your God. So I'm going to do it. I'm going with you. I'm going to commit myself to doing that. All underneath the surface, God is working. I mean, this is the gift of the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, that God is working underneath the surface. So we see it in Ruth. In verse 15 of Ruth 15, or verse 15 of Ruth 4, I mentioned it. The women say to Ruth, your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better than 7 sons has given birth to him. Now, 7 sons was a synonym essentially for the perfect family. And so this was a pretty culturally incredible thing to say to Naomi, God's been so good to you through Ruth. Ruth has been such a powerful indicator of God's love for you that she's better than having 7 sons. And sons were like what in their kind of cultural moment, sons had all the power and all the privilege and all the inheritance. And these women said, no, God's gift to Ruth to you is so powerful. It's better than having 7 sons. Okay, the second thing that we see, so the first thing that we see is the gift of Ruth. The second thing that we see is essentially the preservation of Boaz. So in chapter 1, you're like, okay, this is over for Ruth. She's got no hope. And you kind of get this impression that Naomi's just kind of determined to be a widow with no future and with no hope. She's just kind of like, all right, this is going to be my life. I'm going back to the promised land. This is what's going to happen. While underneath the surface, God's doing what? The whole time, he's essentially been preserving this wealthy and godly man named Boaz, who's practicing the way of God, who's seeking to honor what God has said. And God has been preserving him. God has been keeping him. The reason that we know that is in Ruth 2, verse 20. Naomi, she recognizes the accidental meeting of Boaz and Ruth. So we talked about this in week 2, but the narrator basically says that Ruth happened to find herself in Boaz's field. That was a rhetorical device to help us understand and draw attention to the fact that this wasn't an accident, that God was doing this. And we see in 2012 that Naomi says, in result of this accident, that the kindness of God, that this was a result of the kindness of God who has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi says, this was God doing this. You meeting Boaz was God. God did this. This is God for us. So we have the gift of Ruth, the preservation of Boaz. The third thing that we have is the gift of childbearing. Now, I mentioned it earlier, but both Orpah and Ruth had been in Moab for 10 years. And they had been married to Naomi's sons for those 10 years and had never had children. They were barren in those 10 years, right? Now, you may be thinking, they're like, well, maybe they were working on their dissertation. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe their career took place in this moment and they wanted to get a little further down the line. You know what I mean? Like maybe they weren't trying to have kids. Maybe they were trying to, they had some stuff they had to get in place before they start trying. Well, that's not this cultural moment, right? I get that. That's not the moment we find ourselves in. For them, family was like the pinnacle of life. And so bearing children was a great honor. It was if you were barren in this day in period, it was devastating. It was devastating to your family because your heritage, your legacy, everything was connected to your children. And so for 10 years, they had been in Moab married and barren. I mean, can you feel like the swell that must have like been building up in Naomi's life? Like this kind of swell of like, okay, I've lost my husband. He's gone, but at least I have my two sons. My two sons are married to these women. But now she's finding herself, she's like, there's no grandchildren. I have no legacy. Then she loses her sons. Do you see this? This complex and difficult journey that she's on. She's like, man, is God caring for me? Does he love me? Well, we get to Ruth chapter 4, and the text tells us what? It tells us that God gives to Ruth and to Boaz children. We notice this. Look what it says. So it says the neighborhood women in verse 11. It says a son has been born to Naomi, and God called the child. And then it says that the townspeople pray for Boaz and Ruth, these women. They know that she's been barren. The reason that they know that is, first of all, she doesn't have children, but it says that they pray that she would be like Rachel. Now, Rachel's story was a story of being barren late and bearing children in late age. It was a miracle that she could have kids. So these women, I don't know who these women are, right? We all need some of these women in our life because they're like, hey, we bless this marriage. We bless this marriage between Boaz and Ruth. We're gonna pray that Ruth is like Rachel, and that she could have children. We're gonna ask God to open her womb, that she could have kids. And then in verse 16 of Ruth chapter 4, it just explicitly tells us that God has done this. Verse 13, it says, Boaz went to her. That means they had sex, and the Lord gave her conception. They directly tied the conception of their son, Obed, to the fact that God had allowed it to happen, that God had supernaturally intervened. Naomi lost her husbands and sons, and God gave her Ruth. She thought that there was no kinsman to raise up to give her offspring, and God gave her Boaz. She was assuming that Ruth was barren, that grandchildren weren't going to happen, and then we see that God gives her a child. Do you see it? Do you see? So this idea of that the journey of the godly is a complex and difficult journey. And that through this journey, we do end up with the promises and the presence of God, but some of the work that we have to do, and this is what I've been thinking about, as I was thinking about closing out Ruth. Some of the work, the majority of the work that I think we have to do, especially as we think about the last 2 years, 3 years, kind of in the moment now, the real work that we have to do, this is not complex, is we have to do a work of essentially two things, of recognizing and remembering. Now, what do I mean by that? Some of the work in our Christian discipleship is recognizing where God is at work right now. Like right now. Where you're like presently looking around, whether you're in a high or low in your kind of journey with God, in assessing, okay, where is God working right now that says to me, God, you're for me, that you love me. I've been thinking about that. We're in personally in a very difficult place in our family. And I've been thinking about this idea of, okay, God, where are you right now? Like, where are you? And I'm looking around like, okay, man, God's given us an incredibly beautiful community of people to surround us. Thank you. Like you've done it. Thank you for that. I'm looking, I'm like, okay, God, you've been giving us the necessary resources to get by right now, to do what we need to do. You're caring for us in real tangible ways right now. You're doing it right now. God, thank you. Thank you. I'm looking at the road, the journey ahead of me, and it feels like it's up 2,000 feet and to the left. Thank you. I'm seeing the signpost that says you're for me. You're with me. I think that's legitimate work we have to do as a people. The second thing that I think we have to do, and this is one of the things I've been trying to do more and more over the last year, is doing the legitimate work of remembering. Like we are as a people, maybe I'm not gonna put it on you, I'll say it to me. I'm the worst rememberer in the world. Like I left a birthday party yesterday. We got down the street and realized I left my keys and I had to go back. We got the keys, left. I got 5 to 8 minutes down the street and realized I didn't have my wallet, right? Then I paid my daughter $2 to go get my wallet because I'm lazy. But just not good at remembering on a really practical level. But we also tend to be a people that don't do a great job of remembering the faithfulness of God in our past. Now, all throughout the Old Testament, I mean, we see this everywhere. Deuteronomy 6:12, God is communicating to his people. He says, be careful not to forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Deuteronomy 8:2, remember that the Lord your God led you the entire journey, these 40 years in the wilderness, so that he might humble you and test you to know what was in your heart, whether you could keep his commandments. Isaiah 46:9, remember what happened long ago, for I am your God. There is no other. I am the God, and there is no one like me. On and on and on and on. We could read scriptures where God is saying, remember, 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 remember. Remember that I'm for you. We take what we call the bread and cup every Sunday as an act of what? Remembrance. That Jesus is alive. That death could not hold him. That the resurrection was not the end, right? That the last enemy to be defeated is death. Remember. And so over the last year, I've kind of created a prayer journal. I'm asking God some really specific things, and which is both intimidating and crazy. And so I'm kind of praying these things. And it's the most gratifying thing in the world. I was doing it this past week because he was answering some things. And it's the most gratifying thing in the world to go, I could pull it right now on my thing where it's like, God's been faithful there. When we recognize and remember, this is what it does in our Christian discipleship. When we recognize and remember, what we're doing is we are refusing to allow our current circumstances, whether up or down, we're refusing to allow our current circumstances to define our journey, our life with God. When we recognize and remember, we're saying, hey, I see my circumstances right now in this moment. And for some of you, it could be bad. And when you recognize and remember, you're saying, I refuse to allow this current moment to define my journey, to define the sum of who I am and what I'm about. Refuse. I refuse. The relationship could end. You could lose the job. Everything that you've been working towards and laying out and just thinking that was life, all that could fall apart. And when we do the work of recognizing and remembering, we say, that does not define me. Jesus defines me. His new life he's given me defines me. This is the work that we do. The message of the book of Ruth is not, if you trust God, God will give you absolutely everything that you need or that you want. That's not the story where it's like, okay, well, I see Ruth's story. It all ended out great for her. And so if I trust him, I'm going to get everything that I want. This is, I can see that in Ruth. This is, it's not the message. The message of the book of Ruth is that if you'll give up whatever vision of your life that you had, this is the Christian journey. If you say, hey, here's the vision I had for my life, I'm going to give it to you, God. I give this to you. I give this vision of my life. The Christian life is, I give it to you, and this is what God does. God gives you your life back. And it's better, it's different, but it's better. So we say, I surrender to you. I give this up to you. I'm going to trust in whatever is looking like. As we come to the close, I love Naomi's story. So we get to the end. And the end of Naomi's story is the ultimate proof that regardless of where we're at on our journey with God, in our godly life, that God is going to find us in the presence of himself with his promises. This is the end of her story. Look at verse 17, Ruth chapter 4. It says, the neighbor woman said, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now, why is that a big deal? Why do we need to know this information at the end of Ruth? Well, if you go to Matthew chapter 1, you don't have to go there, but the genealogy of Jesus is in Matthew chapter 1. So verses 1 through 17 is the full genealogy of Jesus. Some of you are like, I always skip that part. I gotta get to the, can't say half those names, most of those names. But what we see is if you can go back and look later, in verse 5 starts with Boaz. In verse 16, it ends with Jesus. Boaz in verse 5, 16 is Jesus. Matthew 11:17 ends the genealogy this way. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David until the exile to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the exile to Babylon until the Messiah, 14 generations. Ruth, the beginning of Ruth's story, which looks like desolate and just death, because it is, ends at the end of Ruth's story with the fact that in the lineage of Naomi comes Jesus. The Messiah of the world comes through the birth and the marriage of Boaz and Ruth. Do you see God communicating and saying, no, I'm for you. Like you will end with my promises and in my presence. This is the cross. This is the resurrection. It's the ultimate signpost in front of us to say, keep going. God's for you. Keep going. Keep moving forward. And so maybe you're here this morning and you're like, man, God's not for me. But if you look at my life, you're just like, God's not for me. Maybe the word this morning, if you identify as a follower of Christ, that is a lie from the enemy. It's a lie from the enemy. So maybe this morning you're like, God, I need to figure that. I need to see. I need to look more clearly. I need to look harder. Maybe you're here, you're like, man, I don't do a good work of remembering. I need to see God's faithfulness. Maybe in just a moment, you need to have that conversation with God. You need to just ask him to help you.